So I'm not going to reread all of that. But anyway, so Elise, her most recent project, or her most recent project, is focused on creating an online portal for state-specific IPM information. Doug Walsh is a professor of entomology at Washington State University. Doug has been involved with the IPM centers since their inception and has served on the center advisory board or committee for many, many years. Doug is the Washington State IPM coordinator. I believe that's still correct, right, Doug?
Yes.
Yep. And very familiar with the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture funding programs, including the one that funds the IPM Center. He's also the past chair for the Regional Technical Group for IPM in the West, known as WERA 1017, and also chair of the National IPM Coordinating Committee. So he's really familiar with not just this program, but many programs that fund integrated pest management work in the West. And Doug Johnson is the executive director for the California Invasive Plant Council. He has been the project director or co-project director on several successful proposals, including the most recent project focused on expanding the capacity for invasive plant risk assessment in the West. So what I thought we would go ahead and do is we would start with several frequently asked questions. So these are questions that project directors often pose to us. And I would go ahead and I'll just go ahead and pose those questions to each panelist and then allow them to answer. And then if other panelists would like to also jump up, pile on, then that would be terrific too. So I'm going to start with the first question. Yeah, Doug, do you have a question? Nope. Okay. Thought you were raising your hand. So I'm going to pose this first question to Elise. All of the projects that the center funds are single-year projects, and they're capped at $30,000. So the question is, how do you scope a one-year project? Like, what's enough to make the project meaningful, but not so much to make reviewers say there is no way on God's green earth that you are going to successfully complete this in 1 year for $30,000?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that at my university anyway, we have almost 53% overhead on this. So actually on a $30,000 grant, I take home $14,995. So that's essentially half the grant. So the way I work on it is there's two general ways you can work on it, right? You can have Western IPM fund a smaller piece of a larger project. I don't tend to go in that direction because it's kind of, sometimes you don't know if you're going to get funding for the rest of it, or of course you can fund a smaller project. And the two projects that I got funded by Western IPM were outreach, the outreach grants. So I was producing a sort of a piece of outreach. And to be honest, I'm just familiar enough with creating outreach products that I'm fairly knowledgeable on about how many hours something will take and if it's doable in a year. And actually, I think Western IPM is an excellent place to go when you've got a great idea, smaller thing you want to produce, because people hours can cost a lot of money. So for example, my first Western IPM was actually to create this. How cute it is. It's a management guide for invasive plants in Arizona. It's super beautiful and blah, blah, blah. And it's created in a way so managers can keep it in their back pocket when they're in the field. So this is a very sort of compact, small item, super useful, but creating that I knew would not be this multi-year project, but it was also too big to sort of tack it on as an outreach component to a larger project. So that's why I thought it would be great for Western IPM. So I think the idea is like, when you know that there's a need, a very specific need, and I know we'll get to that later, and you can address that need with sort of a compact, sort of either single use, like one event or a series of a small number of events, or something like a booklet or a website that you spend some time and then it kind of goes off on its own. I think that that's an excellent way to think about it, but be very cognizant of the overhead. And that's not a small thing because, 30 grand is great. And 15 grand, that can modify, your ability to create or not create what you said you're going to do.
Yeah, that makes good sense. Doug, did you want to add anything to that? Doug Johnson, sorry. Well, I guess I'll go Doug Walsh since I said Doug Walsh first.
Sure. I guess we're all concerned about the indirect charges and all that. And one of in the early days of the IPM Center, when we were first initiating the grant program, one of the most criticisms that we received was basically not documenting basically stakeholder involvement. And the way that I sort of faced that was I went directly to the stakeholders and actually made them the actual grant applicants. And so they would go in and ask for the actual $30,000. And then I became a subcontractor. And typically, I'm not sure with other states, but here in Washington State, when you receive funding from your commodity organizations, they're usually devoid of the indirect charges. And so you actually do get your actual bang for the buck if you go that route, and you sort of kill two birds with one stone because you've documented your industry support. And then likewise, they're directly involved in the project you're working on. So that's sort of the way that I've sort of gotten around the indirect cost issues.
Doug Johnson?
Yeah, I think separate from the cost question, well, on the cost question, these, like Elise says, these are, relatively small grants, especially if you're getting some carved off. But they're really well positioned because they are a one-year chunk to take a discrete project that may be too big to tack onto something else, too small for a full project somewhere else. I think for us, on our projects, picking something that can be done in 1 year and can stand alone as, yeah, it's worth doing, even if that's all the funding you get. But if there's a phased approach and there's the possibility of getting renewed funding, then leaving yourself at a place where you can stop, or actually it really is a good jumping off point for the next phase. So for instance, in our current project, I think that might be you, Matt, typing.
Sorry, I was just typing in the chat.
Herd of elephants somewhere. But our first year, we brought together as a work group 3 other states to partner on an effort. In our second year, we brought in another state and a tribal entity and are doing more of the same, but also something different. So there's a logic to the flow of the deliverables that's leading somewhere, and it's good. The 1 year product is good, the 2 year product is good. If we ended there, we'll keep going as best we can and we'll do good stuff. And if we are fortunate enough to get a follow-up grant, there's a next phase that we can continue with. So I think for ourselves, even though we don't have a huge overhead problem, we are ambitious and we want to make sure we don't promise too much, while at the same time promising enough that it's actually accomplishing something and compelling. So I would say we've probably put in on each of the grants that we've had from Western IPM Center, we put in some of our own funding to make it as competitive as possible. And we're fortunate enough to be able to do that a little bit.
I think I just want to highlight what Doug just said. I totally agree with. I think that would make an application super competitive. Say, and this is what I'm going to do. And you can have a finished product, but you leave the door wide open so that that product could be developed in year 2 or 3 if you get other funding or whatever. So if you're going to make a website, you complete the website, make it so that users can use it, but maybe you want to add another component if you get funding somewhere else in year 2. Or I made this book and, every 5 years, if I get more money, I can update it or something like that. So you can promise to address the deliverables that you are promising to Western IPM, but also you're leaving the door open, even leverage the Western IPM funding into something even bigger. I think that would be a great way to have a really competitive application.
Yeah, and we definitely love leveraged funds. If you can turn, the $30,000 that we've funded into, $300,000 or $3 million, that obviously makes folks in the region really happy because it demonstrates that we're addressing an important priority issue. All right. Is there anything else on that question, or should we go to the next question? All right. So I was going to pose this question to Doug Walsh. Um, how do you write a compelling proposal? What tips do you have? Like, where would you put your focus? What have you learned from successful and unsuccessful grant applications that tell you what a compelling proposal looks like?
That's a good and tough question, Matt. I guess, kind of going back to the how I look at the grants program from the Western Region IPM Center, what we've been really successful with, certainly in the commodities that I work with, is developing the pest management strategic plans. And what that has done for us is basically that sort of gives us the stakeholder backing. And I can say that we organized a group of 28 alfalfa seed growers, 100 hop growers, whatever. And basically this is what they wanted. And this is what they wanted from IPM and whatnot. And then we've taken that and basically cite that as a, basically why we're competing for a larger grants, for myself, most specifically, like say the Specialty Crop Research Initiative grants through NIFA. And so having one of those, relatively up-to-date pest management strategic plan is really sort of a silver bullet in your gun. And then to be a little facetious here, invariably on a lot of these grant panels for these larger grants, they always have one of the regional IPM directors on the grant panel. And if you happen to mention that, the role of the IPM Center and you're developing your, your compelling discussion for why you want to get that grant and why it's necessary, you always get a good nod of approval, more than likely, from that regional IPM coordinator that'll be serving on the grant panel. And that's actually, I've actually seen that when I actually read through the reviews that we've gotten of both successful and unsuccessful proposals we've submitted to NIFA. You can almost pick out the guy that's the regional IPM coordinator who's on that review panel based on their evaluation of the project submitted. So that's sort of the, those are the grants that I think I've appreciated the most from the IPM centers, developing these pest management strategic plans. I've received other grants, but those are the ones that I think in the long run have really leveraged the best.
I'd like to add to that. So I think that proving need is critical. A lot of people can be like, weeds are bad. Like, you need some numbers and citations to go along with that. Remember that the people who might be reviewing your paper, they might, work on pecan or weeds in pecan orchards. And if you're talking about weeds in wildlands, maybe they don't care. So to make them care, you need to back up what you're saying with statistics on how detrimental that weed is that you're focusing on, using maybe numbers per acre or fire, something like that. The money and the statistics where your mouth is in terms of talking about need. And also, a lot of times there's need that I hear about with stakeholders, and I'll mention that there's stakeholder need from, informal surveys or whatever, but usually I can find something that's been published or some kind of formal assessment that is also another, another sort of bolster for why there's a need to address this weed or that, or produce this outreach product. And then something that I think also works is when you talk about whatever you're going to create with the money, give evidence as to why you think that that is an important thing you're going to make. Why does that address the need? If you're going to make a website, do you know if the stakeholders in your region use websites to access information? Or have you seen other websites that have been successful? Or are there too many websites or whatever? But just saying like, okay, there's a problem and I'm going to solve it with a webinar. It's like, maybe people are sick of webinars, or maybe they're not, I don't know. But I think it's very valuable for the application if you can show some kind of evidence shows you have an idea of how the stakeholders are accessing information, how they like to access information, and that hopefully you have some experience making that thing or convening that group or doing something, or if not, saying that you're working with people who will do that. If I was reviewing a proposal of someone who said that they were going to create a webinar series, and nowhere in their CV or nowhere in their experience did it suggest to me that they've ever done that before. That would worry me, because I'd say, like, well, how do you know how to make a webinar series? It's not that hard, but you know. So I think showing need, and then showing who have done the homework to make sure that the thing you're addressing the need with is relevant and appropriate, and you know, stakeholders are going to be benefit from it.
And I would add that one of the ways that you can show that stakeholders are going to benefit, or that you have the capacity, that you know what you're talking about, that you're saying, yes, this is a need, and this is a good way to address it, and we're the ones to do it, is to have letters of support from partners or stakeholders, or whoever is going to be, who's going to benefit from this. In our case, because we were doing a work group, we said we were going to pull together these other states, but if we had just said that and not shown it by having letters of support from the primary representatives from those other states saying, yeah, we're interested in this, we're going to be a part of this, you know, it wouldn't have been credible. So I think that's getting those lined up, getting your partners and your stakeholders lined up front can really help make your proposal credible and compelling. And going back to I think one of Elise's first points is, you don't know quite who's going to be reviewing your proposal and what their familiarity is with your topic. I think back to a proposal we had to a different program where we talked about leading edge populations of yellow star thistle and the Sierra, and we never defined what we meant by leading edge. We just took it for granted that we know what that means. Well, no, they didn't know what that meant. And so don't use jargon, don't be condescending, but start from scratch and really explain what the problem is, what the solution is. Don't take for granted that the person reviewing, think through it as if, you know, don't make any assumptions.
And those letters of support, by the way, if you've never worked with an organization, do not ask them for a letter of support. That is lame. If you have started to work with an organization, you can think about it, but you know, you got to give particularly stakeholder groups or agency groups a long lead time. Maybe a academic might be able to like toss off a letter of support because they got 1,000 of them, you know, in a week or so, or even less. But agency groups, I like to give them 3 weeks. And you don't ask people if you don't know them, because that is not the way to do this kind of work.
Yeah. So we do have a follow-up question, which is specific to this question, which is, what is the best way to represent collaboration or collaborative agencies on a project? Like letters of support, list them in key personnel, have them as co-directors. What would be the best way, in your opinion, to represent that collaboration in your proposal? And I'll pose that out to all 3 of you.
I was just going to say all 3 of those sound great.
Yeah,
I mean, we've maybe in part because ours is a work group proposal, that's how we've done it. But we've got a group of people, we list them, we list their qualifications and who they represent, and we get letters of support from them, and then the principals are co-PIs with us, or if not a co-PI, they're you know, is listed as a very strong active partner on a kind of a steering committee.
You know, another thing that I've done myself, probably because I work very closely with the hop industry here in the Pacific Northwest, is the simple fact is that it's been easier to sort of host the results of some of like the IPM projects that the IPM Center has funded. In particular, the IPM Center basically has helped us produce our IPM guide for hops, both all the first, second, and third editions. And it's actually easier to host it on the USA Hops website than it is on a university website, because we don't have to conform to all the university formatting and folderol. And then the best part is they become responsible for managing that content. And, you know, because for all of us that work for universities, we get that finite grant, we work with it for 2, 3, 4 years, whatever. In this case, maybe just 1. And then they tend to atrophy. So in other words, basically sloughing it off onto your stakeholders and say, well, you maintain it as proves that they're involved in the project.
I think that's a very important point about if you're creating something, whether it's Elise's pamphlet that's going to need to be reprinted in the future or a digital resource that's going to need to be maintained over time, put some thought into how that's going to work. And I know it's frustrating. We've gotten funding before to build things, and then they obviously are going to need maintenance, but it's like, no, I mean, I'm not talking about Western IPM specifically, but just funding entities in general are much more interested in building something than in maintaining it. So put some thought into how that's going to happen. And yeah, assuming it's a useful product, then there should be somebody willing to help pay for maintaining it, ideally.
I think if you're going to have, if you're working with folks and they're going to do essentially any kind of work, they should be listed as a co. If it's folks that are just showing support, a letter is fine. But when I review, and I've never reviewed for Western IPM, I don't think, but in general, when I review grants, if I see that there's a co-PI and then I see no budget or nothing obvious about how that person is involved in the project, I find that weird. So, be thoughtful about this. Don't just add everybody on, but if folks are going to connect you with stakeholders, that's work, especially for these kinds of grants. That person should be listed as a co-PI or senior personnel or something. If someone's going to lend you their farm to do the work, so if people are involved, they should be listed, but also be conscientious that it would also raise eyebrows if you just had like 9 co-PIs and then the budget doesn't do any work and it's not clear on how they're involved.
Yeah, I would also like to remind folks that if you decide to list people as co-project directors or co-principal investigators for center grant programs, it does involve more paperwork. And I know everybody loves paperwork, but unless they're going to take a lead on some aspect, you might want to think hard about having to generate, a lot more work for yourself. All right. So I'm going to go on to the next question. I'm going to pose this one to Doug Johnson. What are the grant management tasks that you have to try and accomplish once you've been funded by the center? Like, what do you have to do, and how much time does it take to sort of fulfill the back end of this project? So this would be financial tracking, technical reporting, those sorts of things.
That's a good question, and I'm probably not the best person to answer it since I don't do the day-to-day tracking. But I am familiar with the final. Well, I'm familiar with a lot of different grants, and some of them being super onerous, and some of them being super easy. And this one, from my perspective, errs on the easy end, and I feel like everything we do is there's a good reason for it, as opposed to sometimes you're scratching your head like, why do we need to do all this paperwork? So I do feel like the form for the final report at the end of the year is very helpful in guiding, like, hey, these are the specific questions you need to answer and why. This is what we're trying to get out of it. Here are some examples. So it's a clear process, which is super helpful. But I think I should probably pass this on to Elise and Doug Walsh to see. Oh no, Elise is making a face as well, to see if you have direct experience that you might share. Fortunately, Yuta, my coworker who has managed this grant in the past, is out on vacation.
I agree with Doug. Very easy, sort of final reporting. And I've had questions in the past, and admin at Western IPM have been very helpful. So it's not this like black box that some granting organizations are. You could reach out to them anytime, and folks will respond to your email super quickly. So it's not onerous. It's sort of, what did you do with our money and what did you produce? And yeah, I think, was it several years ago that you guys made that poster that had like pictures of things that people had produced?
I think so. Yeah.
Do you remember the poster?
Yeah. I was trying to think of where that was presented.
I don't remember, but it's like, so every now and then I think Western IPM will ask you for maybe a photo or a brief description of what you've done. But again, not onerous at all, particularly compared to other grants.
I guess my thoughts specifically about the Western Region IPM grants program is typically what we've proposed as a group are basically fixed finite products rather than sort of the work groups or something like that. So, we've come in and said, we want to run a pest management strategic plan, or we want to update our IPM manual for grapes or hops or one of the other commodities. And keeping track of the finances for those are relatively easy, especially when, you're going to print, 5,000 copies of a book at X dollar per book. It's, that's an expense. Likewise, we've tried to sort of tie our pest management strategic plans into conferences where the people are already going to be there. And so that sort of helped reduce our travel expenses, by basically keeping them for another half day rather than trying to, do the day and a half slog like we used to do in the past. So for the most part, keeping track of the finances for these Western Region IPM grants is really quite easy.
Great.
Especially if there's a finite product,
Yeah. All righty. Thanks very much for that. So that is all I have in the way of prepared questions. So now I'm going to open it up for other folks to ask specific questions. So you can either take your mic off of mute and pose your question, or you can type your question in the chat. I am monitoring the chat, but I imagine that some of the panelists might be as well. Or you can also raise your hand. That might, my little icon is flesh colored, so it can be kind of hard to see. I think I'm going to change mine back to yellow because it's a lot easier to see. If there are no questions, however, then I will pose my own question, or I will pose.
Matt, if there are no questions, can I mention one more thing?
Oh, absolutely.
So this I think would be germane both to Western IPM as well as in general to collaborations. But folks are interested in collaborating with lots of different groups, particularly stakeholder groups or industry groups. This kind of thing takes time. Relationship building takes a long time. So if stuff is due and you're like, all right, I'm going to slap something together, like just hold off and start developing relationships and wait till the next year. It will turn out much better for you in the end. But these sort of, working with producers or farmers or whatever, you can't just like call somebody up on the phone and you're like, hey, you want to be on my grant? That's not how most of these people work. They're not academics. Their time is worth much more than academics' time. So I would just, strongly suggest that you figure out who you want to work with. If you're not sure, you can talk to your local NRCS, your local cooperative extension, whatever. That you should connect with, or the groups, and then you start a really slow climb to get these people to trust you and invite you into their space, because it's relationship building. It takes a long time.
Yeah, I have a sort of a follow-up quick question for Doug Johnson, because he mentioned Native American Indian tribes, and I think this question of relationship building and the time that it takes is especially pertinent to the question of developing proposals with First Nations or some of the underserved populations that historically we don't do a lot of work with. So Doug Johnson, could you address that question specifically?
Sure. Yes, there has been some relationship development, but I feel like we kind of happened into it. We have an annual conference, and we have several times looked for speakers to share on tribal ecological knowledge. And the last time we did that, the folks we worked with from the Yurok tribe we had multiple conversations about different things, and they're a big tribe, and they have kind of an official folks working on environmental issues that were open to working with us. And so when we asked them whether they were interested in this project, they said yes, which is great. It's definitely a different relationship than with the state governments that we're working with, or state universities. And we're still kind of in conversation about how it's going to work best. And so, but I think it's a really important step to take, and there are all sorts of signs pointing in that direction these days, and including funding for tribal-led stewardship efforts, training, etc. So yeah, I would certainly support making the contacts and either actively cultivating or just organically being in communication over time, and see what develops.
Yeah, makes sense. Doug Walsh, did you want to add anything to that?
I think Elise and Doug really covered it quite well there. And again, it's developing those relationships, and maybe to be a little contrary here, the only thing that I've actually had to do a few times in my career is I've had, like folks that I've interacted with for years sort of drop off and retire. And I've had to actually go onto my website and actually go trolling for new collaborators. And I've been really quite lucky. I mean, I found a group of extension educators working on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, working with small, mostly vegetable farmers, truck farmers, for sort of the organic market. And then they've turned out to be a very valuable partner for me. So, don't hesitate to go fishing when you need to.
Great. We all like fishing. So there, we do have a question. This is fairly specific, so I may have to take this one unless anybody wants to jump on. I will read the question in its entirety. Does the Western IPM Center have any requirements or restrictions on who can apply? I'm a large local government park agency, but we have a consultant that is also interested and actually would be the lead on the project. So the requirements, there's really one requirement. You have to be somewhere in the West, and that's really about it for a project director. As long as you are in one of the states or islands or territories or First Nations in the West, which spans from Colorado west to, let's see, I figured this out the other day. I think Guam is our most western spot, and then north to Alaska down to American Samoa. As long as you're somewhere in there, you're fine. That really is about the only requirement. And then the second part is also what, if any, are the long-term requirements tied to an IPM grant? And this part of the question, I think the panelists can address, or if they are reluctant, I can also address it. So in terms of your long-term outcomes on your individual product, project, what do you promise to do for the center? And long-term, I mean, like, condition changes or possibly behavioral changes, or even I guess knowledge changes can be somewhat long-term sometimes.
Well, if the center emails you and asks you to be on a panel about getting grants and you say yes, thank you for your money, and yes, I'll be there. I don't think there's anything formally written down beyond the life of the grant. I mean, I assume that it's probably similar to other funding agencies that maybe at some point Western IPM will ask one of us to review. I've never been asked to review anything by you guys, and then of course, if Western IPM is doing something, like a couple of years ago, they made this poster and they showed pictures of all the folks who had secured grants. So they asked us for images or a description, super minimal stuff, but it's none of it's formal or regular or expected, as far as I know. Very, very simple. When you're done, you write your final report, and then maybe Western IPM or folks from Western IPM will reach out to you for something. I guess you could say no, but you probably don't want to do that.
Going back to the first part of the question, Matt, I think probably what an agency or an entity would need, as well as a taxpayer ID number. I don't think you want to put your personal social security number down on the application. And so that does take a little bit of work. I'm assuming that your recipients are going through the NIFA portal towards developing those taxpayer ID numbers, Matt.
Yeah, that's correct. And that process has recently changed. They updated it, and now it doesn't work so well anymore. So it takes months and months and months. We've had several projects that have been delayed because that DUNS system has changed to something new, and it doesn't work so well. So yeah, if you have to apply for a new DUNS number, it's a bit of a headache. I think that's what you're referring to, right, Doug? Or is that not right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, so that's sort of what in sort of the government system, they recognize your taxpayer ID number.
Right.
And, so that's so for someone that would be working for maybe a parks agency, maybe the city that they work at has a number that they can piggyback on.
Yeah, so that's the sam.gov system. It's in the chat now, which is now the new UEI system.
Sure. Because all of us that work in the land grant university system, that's sort of our bread and butter, and, they're well established, but that's probably a little bit of a competitive disadvantage for entities that don't live on grants per se.
Yeah, it looks like the follow-up question is really future reporting. So Matt, at the risk of learning that we're not doing something that we're supposed to be doing, is there anything formal beyond the end of the grant period? Or is it just kind of the expectation that you're going to take your deliverables and keep working with them? I mean, it's, if you print something, you're going to be getting it out there. If you started a collaboration, you're going to be continuing that collaboration.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And both you and Elise have pretty much said what we expect. At the end of the 1 year, once the final technical report has been submitted, that's it. You're done. We do not have any reporting requirements beyond that 1 year. However, every once in a while, we like to pull data and look at how those projects have done over the years, and so that might be a follow-up email or phone call. And project directors are under no obligation whatsoever to reply. There go my lights. To reply one way or the other. Yeah, there is no formal requirement beyond the 1 year technical report. I'm going to go wave my hands at my light meter so the lights come back on.
I do know that some grants, they would love it if you could give them metrics after the fact to say how something, what some outcomes looked like. And because they can't really require you to do anything beyond the end of the grant period, the workaround is to perhaps survey folks who are involved in the project to say, how do you think your behavior will change in the future because of what you just learned, that kind of thing. So I don't think there are specific metrics that you require reporting by, but it's always useful if one can come up with some quantitative as well as the qualitative ways of presenting the outcomes.
Yeah, and actually Doug touched on it earlier when he talked about the pest management strategic plans, which is a type of a document that we fund. And oftentimes those documents will have impacts way into the future. So one of those documents will then spark a grant proposal, which will get funded. And obviously that's well after the finished product has been developed. And sometimes we will go back, and I think we've talked to Doug several times and asked him, if SCRI projects were spurred on by pest management strategic plans.
And the answer is most definitely yes. And I think even in one of my successful SCRI grants, our pest management strategic plan was starting to show its age. It had been 6 or 7 years since we'd updated it. And in the actual application that we turned into the SCRI program, we said we were going to redo the pest management strategic plan. So when we actually got the grant, we all looked at one another and said, darn, we have to do that again. So, but we got her done.
Yeah. Let's
That's the
see.
funny thing about grants. You get the money and you're like, oh, now I have to work.
Yep. Yeah, don't propose anything you don't want to do. So I'm not currently seeing any additional questions. We have about 15 minutes left for the webinar. So I'm continuing to monitor.
You know,
Let's
Matt,
see.
we can mention something the panelists had talked about is the potential of sharing proposals. I'm not going to post my proposals anywhere, but if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm going to put my email in the chat. I'm happy to share my proposals. I got one this year, 2017.
Okay.
So
Great. Thanks. So, oh yeah, here we go. Okay. Does the Western IPM Center have a frequently asked questions page? No, we don't. We do keep the questions that we get, but we don't in fact have them. We do not in fact have them posted on the website, but I will write that down as a note to Steve that that's probably something we should consider.
Yeah, and FAQs document could be useful. It's great that you have these webinars too. I think it's a good practice for making sure that people have an avenue to get clear on what they're doing.
Yeah. So I have a question which is to the negative side. I think most people have submitted grants and not been funded during that grant. How useful were the comments from the reviewers, not just on this, not just on this program, but in other programs as well? And what kinds of things did you do to follow up? Like you think it's really a good idea and you think it should be funded, and yet the reviewers didn't see it that way. What can you do to really address those comments and make a more successful proposal? And I don't have anybody specific that I was going to ask this to.
I was going to say you can explain what leading edge means, and then and then try again. But yeah, feedback is super useful, and it's frustrating when you can't get feedback from a potential funder, because then it is a black box. So it's very useful when one gets specific feedback and you can address it by either adjusting the scope or bringing more partners in and recording your. Okay.
Sorry about that.
And kind of, justifying your credibility, et cetera. And sometimes it could just be a competitive round where there's a lot of good proposals. So sometimes it's nothing really that needs to be improved necessarily, although there's always something that can be improved a little. So definitely reach out if a program doesn't automatically have feedback that comes your way. Certainly ask.
yeah, I think having folks that are outside of your sphere look at your proposal is a good way, because I think particularly for these types of grants, when you have viewing that might be non-academic stakeholders, you want to make sure you're not using jargon and all that, but you might not know because you're in it. So have someone else look at it. I actually applied for 2 Western IPMs and I got them both. So I haven't, but I only applied for 2. But so I haven't been on the receiving end of, actually I've received comments for both of them actually, which were helpful. But what I tend to do in general with proposals is that when I resubmit, if there's review that can't just be addressed like explaining leading edge, if there's more like a theoretical or something like that, I will actually bring it up somewhere in the proposal that I've addressed that and talk about it. And reviewers usually are much more likely to like accommodate for things going on in your proposal if they know this is your second time and that you've made an effort to update and address previous comments. But the only way they're going to know that is if you bring it up. I know Western IPM is a fairly short, especially compared to other places, it's a fairly small proposal, so you don't want to take too much space. But if you've applied in the past and received like, I'm not going to say heavy criticism, but criticism or comments on a a point that takes sort of discussion to deal with, I would bring it up in the proposal, and I think it can only benefit you.
I agree with all that. I guess the point is that your proposal is only as good as its weakest link. And, you know, the point of it is that grant review panels tend to be real good at finding those weak links. And, you know, as Elise mentioned here, if you address that weak link and you demonstrate what you've done to mitigate that can carry some weight.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Certainly, panel members spend a lot of time really trying to figure out, you know, what the weakest part of the proposal is, and you know, because that's, you know, what they're trying to figure out is, you know, if there's this weak spot, is that going to cripple the proposal? So that's what they spend a lot of time doing. We do have a question in the chat. The question, I'm not sure it relates to our request for applications because of the page numbers 13 to 26. I don't believe our request for applications is quite that long. So I think this might be a USDA proposal, maybe AFRI or Crop Protection Pest Management. Kai, do you want to clarify? Because I'm not sure. Maybe you could clarify what your question is here for us.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This morning while I was looking through the I should say the website, I found the link to a Department of Pesticide Regulation. And on it just say Alliance Grant Program 2023 solicitation. And on it, there's a bunch of forms that were on there, and this is where I pull out the application. So unless I'm happen to be on the wrong link, then I might have printed out the wrong application.
Yeah, so California Department of Pesticide Regulations does run a program called the Alliance Grants, which are related to developing integrated pest management programs within California. Those are multiple year grants, so you might get, you know, $100,000 to $200,000 to work on a project for 3 years. And in that case, of course, you would fill in years 1, 2, or 3, depending upon how long your project is going to be. Our grant program, the projects are limited to only 1 year, so there would be no columns 1, 2, or 3 for the 3 years. But the conversation that we've been having, of course, is highly relevant because, in essence, if you think of a 3-year grant, it's really just 3 one-year parcels. So, you know, if you're trying to develop a program or a project that is 3 years long, or 1 year long, you still have the same considerations of, you know, feasibility of accomplishing the tasks within the time frame. So, yeah, I would think that you would still be thinking about the problem in a similar fashion.
Not to speak out of school, but those those projects have a lot more administrative burden, shall we say, DPR. But, and just to clarify, you're saying, Matt, that it's not like you would just use one column of this application. This is not, that's the DPR application. You all have your own application form completely separate.
Kind of going back into my memory here, I don't mean to correct you here, Matt, but you know, we had an episode a few years back where we actually turned in parallel grants, one to the North Central Regional IPM program, one from the Western Region IPM program. And that truly demonstrated our national unity, and both were actually received pretty well by that. So there's nothing stopping you in these programs from partnering outside of the region, but you tell your folks outside of the Western region, you need to go get your own bag of money.
And actually, that's an excellent point, Doug. And it should be noted that not all of the 4 centers, there's 4 IPM centers, one for each region. The Northeast region has projects that are multiple years, I think 2 or 3 years. So that's actually what I thought maybe this was about. And I think also the North Central region has project timelines that can be 2 years. So some of the IPM centers will fund multiple years. We do have a hand up. Melissa, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, yes, I do. So I worked on a project that was funded through a project initiation grant through the Western IPM Center last year. And as is often the case, the research raised new questions. And so I'm wondering, our group is wondering if it would be worthwhile to submit a proposal for a new project initiation grant, assuming that, I mean, it is a new question, but it's related to our old question. So I was just wondering if it would be worth submitting, or if it would hurt or help the chances, or what your thoughts are on that.
Who wants to try and field that question?
Well, Matt, I would have thought maybe you know the best, but I would say that I think it can only help you if you can show, and this harks back to something we talked about before, sort of leveraging funds. So if you can show that sort of the development of a project leading to new ideas or new directions, then that absolutely seems like something that Western IPM would want to support. They might not, obviously, it's always sort of a crapshoot, right? But I think that you would really want to bring that into your proposal, that you're like, look what we did with this money, look what we were able to achieve. And then we addressed all these questions, but then we developed all these new ones, or we made new connections. So then we realized these things we have to deal with, or whatever, and then go into your new proposal. So I think that that would be a great way to have a competitive proposal for sure.
You know, and Matt can correct me if I'm wrong here, but, you know, integrated pest management over the years has really begun, or really has encompassed, sort of the urban community IPM aspects. And those have always been far more difficult to really glean the monies that you might get from the traditional agricultural integrated pest management. And I would like to think that the IPM Center would probably be cognizant of that fact. And when you do have an effective team working on a community IPM program, they're going to benefit far more from a $30,000 grant than, you know, the California almond industry developing a IPM program, so to speak. And you know, so I like, for those of you that work in community IPM, I mean, I think this is the Western Region IPM Center is really somewhat unique as being a source of funding for the, you know, these sorts of team building projects.
Doug Johnson, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's covered it. I agree with Elise that if you've got a really important new question that branches off from a previous question, I think that's a really suitable place to go. And if you've done a good job on a previous project, I think that also helps the center feel that much more comfortable in funding you.
Yeah, and I agree with that too. Project initiation doesn't mean that it has to start a new program. It can be an offshoot from, you know, a previous idea that then sparked a new sort of line of investigation. That would still be considered project initiation. So we are up against it now. We have 1 minute left if there are any pressing questions. Otherwise, I think we will wrap it up for today. I want to thank our panelists again for their help. This has been, for me, this was really helpful. I thought this was really interesting, and I'm pretty steeped in this culture. So if I thought it was interesting, I'm hoping other people did as well. So I want to thank you again, everyone, for joining, and thank our panelists again for their help and their insight. And remember that the request for applications will be announced in the October newsletter on the 5th, and we look forward to reading your proposals as they get submitted, probably on December 8th and 9th, but so be it. Thanks again, everyone.
You.
Thank you for organizing this, Matt.